College dorms have gotten wildly expensive. At Oklahoma State, for example, the most a student would pay for housing in 2002 was around $7,000. Today, that number is $16,000. And that's after adjusting for inflation. And no, it's not tied to the housing market. It's actually because of a much sneakier reason that's not great for students. While students are paying much higher bills for housing, the universities themselves are making a profit. Take Clemson University, for example. According to the school's financial records, the revenue brought in by housing surpassed maintenance costs by at least $17 million in each of the past 5 years. So what's going on here? Back in the day, dorm rooms, at state universities at least, usually looked like this. Or this. Very simple, no frills. For most people, it's their first experience of living apart from their parents, so they don't need a lot. And this was in line with the reason for on-campus housing in the first place. The first colleges in the US tended to be built in more isolated and rural areas. The idea was that students should be separated from the distracting and potentially corrupting influence of city life. Dorms were also necessary because of how remote some of these universities were. This served to help create an isolated scholastic bubble. It was also tied to the concept of environmental determinism, the idea that your environment could shape your character. And so, on-campus housing was seen as crucial in shaping students into ideal citizens. However, dorm living and the values around it were challenged during World War II, because Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the GI Bill into law, which paved the way for millions of veterans, at least in states without segregation, to attend college. Suddenly, colleges were pressed for housing. This led to the construction of the modern high-rise dorms that we see at bigger universities today. Anyone who went to a big state school probably knows what I'm talking about. But recently, the expectations around dorm rooms seems to be changing. At Louisiana State University, for instance, the upperclassmen can pay to room in a dorm complex with queen-sized beds, private bathrooms, garbage disposals, and granite countertops. The University of Kentucky has also updated nearly all of its dorms over the last 10 years to include luxury amenities, like rooftop terraces and outdoor fire pits. And many of these updated dorms can also accommodate full-size beds, a luxury in the dorm world. These updates, of course, come with a cost.
That a fact. How much do I owe you?
The Wall Street Journal recently conducted an extensive investigation of just how much the price of college housing has changed, and they found some really wild statistics. The cheapest housing option at the University of Kentucky has increased by 75% following these updates. Arizona State has perhaps the most dramatic increase in housing costs. In 2002, it was around $5,000 per year on the low end and around $8,000 a year on the high end. In 2023, the low end for a dorm was roughly $7,000, and the high end for a dorm was more than $20,000. In the journal's investigation of 12 public universities, it found that the median increase for the most expensive housing was 114%. For many of these schools, the price of housing grew at a higher rate than tuition. Take the University of Arkansas. Its tuition increased by 50% since 2001, while the cheapest housing option increased by 75%. And at a lot of schools, students are required to live on campus for at least their freshman year, if not their sophomore year too, because students who live on campus perform better, even if they go further into debt. So how is this getting paid for? Traditionally, money for constructing housing at publicly funded schools comes from the school's own budget, and that money comes from state taxes as well as tuition and room and board. However, for many state schools, state funding has decreased over the last 20 years. And while some of that additional cost does get shifted to students in their tuition bills, many schools have figured out another way to get additional funds, by working with private developers. In the early aughts, universities started selling development contracts to private contractors. These private companies that specialized in student housing could build much more cheaply and quickly than the universities could. So here's how the deal works. A university leases their land to the developer, and the developer handles construction, including management costs. The developer is then in charge of setting the housing rates and receives most of the housing revenue, with a cut going back to the university as well in most cases, but only for a set lease agreement timeline. And once the lease agreement expires, the title for the building will go back to the school. These leases often span anywhere from 40 to 85 years. The school, meanwhile, can use the capital it saved on construction and managing a whole new dorm for other needs of the university. UMass Amherst is a good example of this type of arrangement. Last year, they partnered with Axiom Infrastructure to build a 623-bed dorm in the middle of its campus. The deal is a big win for the school, since they not only don't have to pay for any of the costs of adding more housing to their campus, but they also received a $20 million upfront service concession fee as part of a 65-year concession agreement. Axiom will build, finance, and manage the units for 65 years, after which the ownership of the building goes back to UMass. The students, however, get the short end of the stick, because the contract contractors get to set the rates at these properties, and the schools get to say, we're not the ones setting the prices. Similarly, LSU is making $2 million a year off the luxury Nicholson Gateway housing complex they added to campus after partnering with private equity. And it doesn't have to do anything in terms of running the building. And it's such a great deal that we're starting to see private developers form that build college housing exclusively. The Education Realty Trust has worked with the University of Kentucky, Syracuse University, and the University of Alabama. Axiom Infrastructure has worked with the University of Iowa and now UMass Amherst. And American Campus Communities has partnered with the University of Michigan, the University of Illinois Chicago, Arizona State, and tons of others. It's been so successful, in fact, that it was bought by Blackstone in 2022. And it's so comforting to think of the students at these public universities being taken care of by a private equity firm like Blackstone.
Kind of sensing a theme here, huh? Something about hedge funds and private equity managers and the endowment.
Even the cost of older housing options at some of these universities has gone up too. So there's literally nowhere to turn. University representatives will say that nicer living spaces are conducive to students getting the most out of their college experience. It also seems to be allowing state schools to make their campuses more attractive, to potentially compete with the more expensive private schools, and that the money saved from building new residence halls frees these institutions up to invest in other aspects of the student experience, like improving campus technology, athletic facilities, libraries, science labs, you name it, which in theory sounds great, but are they? It's tough to say. Right now, colleges aren't required to track expenses in any uniform way, making it difficult to hold them accountable for how they're spending their money. It's alarming to think that even publicly funded state colleges are becoming more out of reach for the average American. But then again, maybe expensive student housing is preparing students for the realities of the housing market in general.